everybody. I hope you enjoyed the ending of the previous story. It was very satisfying for you, and you're ready for the next story from Scotland. Now this story takes place in the very north of Scotland. Scotland, most of it is the mainland. There are many, many islands all around Scotland. Most of them are on the west coast. But far up in the northeast of Scotland, there are two main sets of islands. One are called the Orkney Islands, and further out the Shetland Islands. You might have heard of Shetland ponies, small ponies. They come from the Shetland Islands. Anyway, this story takes place on the Orkney Islands. A long, long time ago, deep in the mists of Scotland, on the Orkney Islands, there was a stone, a large stone. You can actually see the stone in the picture right next to me here on the page. And everybody in Orkney called this stone a stane, because in Scotland you call it, you don't say stone, you say stane. Okay, a big stane. And they called it the Dwarfie Stane, because that stone had been hollowed out inside. It was like a little house. Too small for us. For us to go in, it'd be pretty small for me anyway. But for the dwarf, Snorro, he was called, it was perfect for him, and he lived in there. And a few things you should know about Snorro the dwarf before we get going with this story. Snorro the dwarf had lived in the Dwarfie Stane longer than anybody could remember. Even the oldest woman on the island of Orkney, and she was nearly 100, she can remember that when she was a kid, she was a child, Snorro lived in that Dwarfie Stane, even then. And here's the really weird part. He looked exactly the same then as he looked now. Okay? He was small, had a very twisted body. One arm was a bit higher up than the other, and he walked around with a limp. But the strange thing about Snorro was he had the most beautiful, handsome face. It never changed. The old woman who lived on Orkney said, yeah, when she was a child, if they saw Snorro, he had this beautiful face. And she had grown old, and her face had changed over the years, but Snorro's face had stayed the same. Absolutely beautiful. And the other thing that he did, Snorro, he carried around his neck on a chain a big mirror. And he used that mirror, he would hold it up to his face and just gaze lovingly at himself in the mirror. Because he was very vain. Vain means someone who's always looking at themselves. And I mean, I think nowadays it would be like people who are always doing selfies of themselves and looking at themselves, you know, very vain. And what else should you know about Snorro? Well, people would go to visit Snorro because he spent his whole days walking around in the hillside, finding rare herbs and plants, and he would bring them back, and he would be able to make medicine from them and potions. And people would go to him and pay him. That's how he made his money, selling medicines and potions from a little stall that he had outside of his Dwarfie Stane. And the other thing that he did was, when people came to visit him, he would stand as regally as he could, like a king, like that. And the people, when they came, he would force them to bow down in front of him as if he were a king. And they had to speak to him and say, Your Majesty, and things like that, as if he were a king, or he wouldn't help them. He just loved that. He liked the power of people coming up and bowing and scraping to him and saying, Your Majesty, and thanking you and bowing as they walked away. He loved all that. But the real secret of Snorro was he was searching these hills for something called the magical carbuncle. Okay? The magical carbuncle was like a special stone that was hidden somewhere in a small hill near where he lived. There was a small hill that looked like a wart, like a little lump like that. And people called it Wart Hill, actually. And it was said that on certain nights when the moonbeams shone at just the right angle, the magical carbuncle would be visible. You could take it. And the possessor of the magical carbuncle, if you had that carbuncle, you were forever rich, you were forever healthy, you were forever safe, you were forever protected. It was like having a magical aura around you if you owned the carbuncle. And all that Snorro was doing the whole time was searching the hills for the carbuncle. But he didn't want to let anybody know that's what he was doing, because they would come and look for the carbuncle, and he wanted to be the one to find it. So that's what he did. He went around being very arrogant and rude to everybody. People came to him for these potions and paid him lots of money. So that's what was happening. And he had two other things that were quite scary. One, an enormous leather-bound book with big metal clasps. You had to open it, open the big book up like this, and he would look inside, and that's where all the spells and potions were inside. And the other thing that was normally on his shoulder was a huge black raven, a big bird, like a crow, a black bird that would. And when people came to visit Snorro, even when he looked down at his book to look at his potion recipes and things, the crow would just be looking straight at the people who were there, just to make sure they didn't move around too much or take any of Snorro's special things. And people were scared of the crow. They were scared of the book. They were pretty scared of Snorro. They didn't like going there, okay? And he lived in the Dwarfie Stane. Now, at that time, the whole of the kingdom of Orkney was ruled by 2 earls. Now, an earl is somebody who's not like a normal person like me, and they're not a king. There's things in between, right? And an earl is one of those things that's quite high up, actually, but you're not a king or a prince or something. You're below that, but not a regular person like me. So there were 2 earls. The older one, Earl Paul. The slightly younger one, Earl Harold. Okay, now let's talk about Paul. Paul was tall, handsome, had dark hair, dark eyes like dark berries on a tree. He had a lovely, friendly face and a wonderful smile, and he was very kind to people with his actions. And when he rode through the villages, the little babies and kids would all come crawling and running out and look up at him, and they all absolutely adored him. And the funny thing about him was, he hardly ever spoke. He could speak, but he didn't say very much. He was a quiet guy. And people would just call him Paul the Quiet. Paul the Quiet, that was his kind of nickname, Paul the Quiet. But they loved him. His brother Harold, blonde hair, blue eyes, he was also tall, also handsome. But there was something about him in his face. It wasn't a kind face. He had a little bit of an evil look in his eye, or mean. Not evil so much, just jealousy, meanness maybe. You could see it a little bit in the corner of his mouth as well. And he loved to talk. He loved to talk about how great he was, how he was awesome, how he could do this and that and everything. And people didn't like him so much. When he rode through a village, the kids would scamper away and they would head off, okay? And people actually called him Harold the Bragger, because he was always bragging about what he could do. And they didn't like him at all, really, which was a shame, okay? So there's Paul the Quiet and Harold the Bragger. Now we get to the story. It just so happened that once upon a time in Orkney, at the time of Paul the Quiet and Harold the Bragger and Snorro the Dwarf, there was to be a great celebration, a winter celebration. And Harold the Bragger, he decided that before this great celebration, he was going to travel with his mother, who also lived with them, and his aunt. She was called Countess Fraukirk. Okay? Sounds like a German word, but actually we use those words in Scottish as well. Kirk in Scotland means church. Okay? Fraukirk. And anyway, they got a boat and they went to the Scottish mainland, and they went all the way down to the Scottish capital, to the Scottish king, to the palace. When they went in there and they were at the court of the king for a few days, when suddenly a young lady arrived all the way from Ireland, and her name was the Lady Morna. And the Lady Morna, long brown hair, beautiful face, a lovely personality. She was absolutely beautiful in every way. And of course, Harold the Bragger, he fell in love with her immediately. And he did everything in his power to get close to her and talk to her. And he told her finally he was in love with her and hoped that she would love him back. but she'd noticed the way that he sometimes spoke to his servants. Get away, be quick about it, hurry up. And she saw the snappy way he would speak to them. She didn't like it. She saw that even though he was trying to be nice to her, there was another side to him, a dark side. So she turned him down. She said, no, I'm not in love with you. He was furious, but he didn't want it to show. He sort of kept his mouth kind of straight like that. Okay then. Tried not to let it show too much. He wanted to stamp his feet or shake his fist, but he didn't. He walked off and he tried to think of a way that he could win her love. And then he had an idea. What about the winter celebration in Orkney? Surely if he invited her all the way up to Orkney and they saw their palace and they saw all the things that they had up there, the beautiful Orkney Islands, she would see him in his natural home and she would see him in a different light and she would fall in love with him. And so she agreed. So it was that Harold, his mother, Countess Fraukirk, and Lady Mona travelled up to Orkney. When they got to Orkney, it wasn't very long before Paul the Quiet saw the Lady Mona. And the Lady Mona saw Paul the Quiet. And you know what happened, right? They immediately fell in love with one another. But there was a problem. Harold was in love with Mona. What is going to happen next in our story? What's going to be Snorro's involvement? What's he going to do? Okay, let's find out next time when we come back to the story. This is a little bit different from the other two stories because it's more of a serious kind of story. It's not as funny. But I think in grade 3 you can have these serious stories too, okay? And notice how I make the characters different. One is a quiet one, he's got like a nice personality, the other one a bit mean. And in your stories, if you have somebody who's mean, and you say at the beginning of the story, oh, this character's mean, the character has to be mean in the story. You can't just say they're mean and then they don't do any mean things. Or if somebody's kind, you can't just say they're kind and then they don't do kind stuff in the story. So if you say the character is like that, they have to behave in that way in your stories, okay? That's what we're looking for in your writing. So I'll see you next time when we come back to the second part. It's got more of Snorro in it and potions and some pretty bad behaviour from Snorro and Harold actually, and the mum and Lady Fraukirk, okay, Countess Fraukirk. So look forward to that next time. I'll see you then, okay? Bye now.